Bismillah. To start with, I'm going to start with a bit of a disclaimer. So while I am a registered psychotherapist, today's talk will not be therapy. It is going to be educational. So I wanted to start off by saying that. Also, as part of the preamble is we're having a general talk today on spiritual abuse. That being said, I think the elephant in the room is this is coming in the wake of a major case that came out a few weeks ago. So I don't want to ignore that. So I wanted to start by saying, at least for me, that case brought up a lot of strong emotions. So I wanted to start off by that at that point. For me, and I think for a lot of people I've been talking to, there's been really strong feelings of anger, disbelief, fear, shock, disgust, anxiety, all of it. So I wanted to start off by saying there's a lot of emotions. For different people, different emotions are stronger. Very normal for you to feel different emotions. But today, we don't have a lot of time. And while I think emotions are very important, today's talk is going to be focused more on education. I'm a big believer in education being powerful. So in order for us to really work on doing a better job as a community, supporting survivors, doing better in terms of institutions and holding people accountable and working on prevention, inshallah, we need to have a better handle of what are we talking about. So while emotions are going to be important, I'm going to put them a little bit on the back seat. In terms of setting the stage, what I'd like to do, I'm going to be honest, I don't have a lot of time. There's a lot to cover in a short amount of time. I'm going to try to really focus in on definitions a little bit. So what is spiritual abuse? What does that mean? What does that look like? How does it happen? I want to talk about victim blaming. What are warning signs of spiritual abuse? What can you do to start working on healing? And what can we do as a community to support survivors? So I'm going to do my best to cover, touch on each of those topics a bit. I'm going to start with a bit of a definition. Spiritual abuse occurs when individuals use spirituality, using religion to control, manipulate, and essentially harm individuals. This does not necessarily have to be at the hands of spiritual leaders, to be honest. Though today I'm going to say, at least for my part, I'm going to be focusing in on the spiritual leaders being the source of the spiritual abuse. In terms of what that abuse can look like, it can range. It can range from financial, spiritual, physical, sexual, everything in between, and all of the above. So it can range. Spiritual abuse. So in terms of, I guess a little bit more about my background, in terms of as a therapist, my focus is on trauma. Spiritual abuse, it's a heavy one. It's a whole other level of trauma. The reason why it can be so devastating for people is that this happens in spaces, and I know a lot of us can relate to that in this room, where we expect to feel safe. We expect to feel full, heard, increase our connection to God. And when abuse occurs in that context, it can shake so much for an individual. And as you see here today, as a community, it really shakes us. So it's something that is really important. For that individual, it really can start impacting how their relationship in terms of their beliefs about God, about the religion. So it has far-reaching impacts. I know one of the things that people often want to know is, how can this happen? How can this happen in the Muslim community? And how can this happen with our spiritual leaders? And before I kind of get into how can that happen, one of the things that I keep hearing about in informal conversations, formal conversations, and maybe many of you have, is this narrative of victim blaming. And victim blaming is kind of how it sounds. It's blaming the victim for what's happened to them, how they've been transgressed against. And what that sounds like, at least to me, is often people thinking that that individual is lying. They think that that person is stupid, that they should have known better. Why wouldn't they have gotten out earlier? Why wouldn't they have reported it? That's what I would have done. There's a lot of that narrative. And I want to say that it's very harmful. I'll be honest, it's part of the problem of spiritual abuse and abuse in general, is leading to people not disclosing. And research shows that it's very rare for people to lie about these things. And I'll be honest, one of the biggest things I hear about is, are they actually telling the truth? Is this really possible? And just studies consistently show it's a small percentage that actually would lie about such things due to the seriousness of the consequences. So I do want to be clear that that's not a helpful narrative in our discussions, and it's part of the problem, to be very honest with you. Sorry, I have lots of notes to try to keep me on track. There is a lot of barriers when it comes to individuals reporting or speaking out. So, for example, they're ostracized. There's name calling. There's fears of being removed from the community. There is fears of going to authorities. So whether that be law enforcement or it is the religious institutions, going to other spiritual leaders. And let me be clear, these barriers are actually, they're not in their minds, right? Like I think we all know these are real barriers, that there is name calling, that there are people not believing them, that they are kind of shunned often in our communities. So these are real barriers. And this is part of the reckoning we need to do as a community, as how do we do better? And both of us will revisit that. I do think it's an important question after, so what is spiritual abuse? Is how does it happen? One of the big things that happens, and it's not unique to spiritual abuse, it's overall to abuse in general, is grooming. Grooming, what it is, it's slow and steady boundary trespassing, essentially. So it's done very subtly and slowly. So often people don't understand how we get from, one spot to the next. How does it get there is grooming. They're slow and steady, chipping away at what most of us have are walls up or barriers to protect us. So what these abusers do is they start chipping away at it. And often people don't even realize how far it's gotten before it's too late. Spiritual abuse is really bad in that it really looks at undermining your beliefs about yourself. So it really looks at making you feel unworthy, that you're sinful, that there's something wrong with you. So that's a big part. Unfortunately, spiritual abusers often use the Quran, Hadith, other spiritual practices, let me be clear, incorrectly, but they use this as a way to manipulate survivors. They use religious rhetoric. So they're using our words, right? They're using Arabic. They're throwing in Quran, throwing in Hadith. Again, I would say incorrectly, but they're doing this. And as a community, we've been taught that we hold spiritual leaders to a higher level, right? So part of how this occurs is that there is this belief or assumption that this abusive leader will do is that they're in a higher level between you and God, right? So that for you to have, to not be a sinner, for you to make it into Jannah, that you need to be listening to them, right? So they're manipulating you by using the rhetoric, using the words. Another thing that I think is important is, as a community, I think in all communities, but dare I say more in our community, is that we have this culture of almost not wanting to call out or question our leaders. And I think it comes from a good place. However, by having that culture of, we don't really question what spiritual leaders are saying and what they're doing, it can really lead to more secrecy around the abuse it can encourage it to continue, and it can lead the person who is being transgressed against from being afraid that they shouldn't say anything because they've been taught you don't say anything, you don't question someone who has more, I'm going to say quote unquote, religious knowledge. So these are important factors that really do impact how does this happen. So we kind of know what spiritual abuse is, how it can kind of happen, and then I would say is you need to know what the warning signs are, because it's easy enough to know what the definitions are, how it can maybe happen. But I think for all of us to either reflect right now in our lives, going forward in the future, things that might have happened in the past, or even in our circle of family and friends, is what are the warning signs? I think one of the big warning signs are leaders that really have a strict obedience kind of policy. They want you, and they're being firm and strict on it, to follow what they're saying. And they discourage critical thinking, which again, might be easier for us to say in this room that, you know, what kind of leader would do that is these are subtle things that happen over time, where it might not be how they lead, but it might be where you're at. So that's important. They become overly involved in your personal life, meaning your day-to-day decisions. So in terms of, it could be where you, kind of job you have or where you might work, the clothes that you wear, who you're around, who you spend your time with, all those things. So they're starting to get involved in your day-to-day lives, as well as decisions that you might need to be making for yourself. This one I think is really important, and for me it's almost one of those ways to test if you're in this type of scenario is they use shame, guilt, they make you feel unworthy, sinful, they make you feel anxious, depressed. Our faith is beautiful, and a good spiritual leader would never have you feel in those ways. So to me, that's a good litmus test of how you're doing and where things are at if you are questioning things. So it is in your gut, do they make you feel better and want to do better and be better, or do they bring you down? And it might not always apply, but I think it's a good one if you have a yes to that answer, it's something for you to really think about further if this is the right place for you. Another tactic, or a warning sign, I should say, is they try to slowly over time, again, it's not immediately, is that kind of like, maybe you shouldn't be friends with those people anymore, or, maybe your sister isn't the best person to have in your life. So they're kind of slowly removing you from your support system and in many ways isolating you. And again, this is problematic when people think about, well, how can this happen? Is these individuals, these survivors, they're hearing things very almost in a silo now, right? They're hearing things from one main individual, and they've slowly had their support system kind of removed. Or it could be in some cases when it's not just a one-on-one abuse situation, when there's more of in the situation, maybe like a spiritual leader that's abusive with a group of people, that those become your kind of circle, and it's kind of just like this echo chamber that's happening, right? So there's no one to bounce things off of anymore, and that can be problematic, scary, and not a place you want to be. Another one that I think is important, and it applies for different kinds of abuse, is exploitation. And what I mean by that is if they're trying to exploit your resources, so financial, your time, your energy, other types of resources, unreasonably, this is a warning sign. But I guess as a bit of a disclaimer on that point is part of the beauties of our faith and community is that we do charity work. We do work at the masjid. We try to give back in ways. And those are things that are reasonable and things that are beautiful, and inshallah will bring us closer to God. This is different in that it's not really coming from you. It's almost being mandated upon you. So it's no longer, yeah, it's good to donate. It's like, hey, it's good to give, 2/3 of your income to my organization. Or you're required to volunteer 15 hours a week outside of your work in your home responsibilities. When it's no longer on your terms, it's on their terms. So there is a subtle thing. So I don't want anyone to think that if your spiritual leader is encouraging you to volunteer at a soup kitchen, that means it's unjustified to do that. Another one, and again, I would say this is maybe a little bit more for the spiritual abuse involving financials, is there's a lack of transparency. So let's say you have been donating and you kind of want to know what's going on with your donations. When there's a lack of transparency, that's a warning sign. If they're not really able to kind of give you a bit more details, or, hey, let me share with you who we donated it to, or here are the financials. If they're really kind of dodging and weaving around those things, that's a warning sign. So we know what the definition is. We know how it happens. We know what it looks like. What are the warning signs? So what if you're at a place where you're like, I think this is kind of happening to me. What should you do? What I would say step one is to trust your instincts. And I think that's something that's not really talked about enough, to be honest. It's something I talk a lot about in session with clients, is kind of like your spidey sense, right? If your spidey sense is going off that says something's not right here, you're likely right. Another thing I always talk about, particularly with trauma clients, is that there's no one currently on this earth that you should trust completely. And I know that goes contrary to sometimes the way we've been raised, the way we are in community, is that, you should trust spiritual leaders. You should trust your family, friends, your grandparents, all these people fully. That's just not true. And when we get into that type of blindly following people, that's where things can go wrong, to be very honest with you. There is no one on this earth since the Prophet ﷺ that you should be blindly following, right? So if your instincts are telling you something's off, something likely is off. What I would say is another step that you can do is going to your maybe your original trusted family, friends, going to a therapist, because it's really, I can't underscore how difficult it is if you're being in this situation. It can be hard to think clearly. So it's important for you to reach out to see if you can get some help around, what should I do? This is what I'm thinking is going on. It's important that you put some distance between you and the abuser. I know it might seem obvious, but again, spiritual abuse is on a spectrum. It's not all the same severity, and it's not all the same intensity of how serious it is. It would be important, as you're trying to figure things out, is put a little bit of distance between you and them. So in terms of their access to you, whether it be of your time, your money, messaging, maybe if they're at a certain place that you go to, you kind of take a bit of a break there to give yourself a chance to really clear your head a little bit. Finally, I would say is consider leaving. I think, again, good litmus test is if it feels like it's harmful or you're not benefiting from this, and you've tried to maybe advocate for yourself, put in some boundaries. Again, like I said, there is a spectrum for spiritual abuse. I would recommend you leave. One of the beauties of our religion, especially here locally in the GTA, that we do have a lot of spiritual leaders. So it's not that you will be left alone. So even if you're being overly cautious, I would say is you can always revisit that relationship if given some space and time, you realize it's not what you thought it was initially. In terms of the healing piece of things, other than the time part, today's talk doesn't really let me get into the whole, how do I heal from spiritual abuse? Mainly because, like I said, it's such a range of different kinds of abuse. It has to be very individualized in terms of how do you deal with it? How do you treat it? I would say the number one thing I would recommend to anyone here that maybe needs that extra support or knows someone that does is please reach out to a professional. When you go through something traumatic like spiritual abuse, the biggest things that happen is it shakes you to your core in terms of your beliefs about yourself, about the religion, about the world, about other people, safety, trust, power, all these things are really shaken and altered. It's really hard to do that kind of work on your own, to be very honest. Some people can, don't get me wrong. The vast majority cannot. So I'd recommend, for example, here in-house at ISNA, there's ISNA Cares, which is a great option for people when it comes to therapy. I would put a disclaimer in that many people who have been transgressed against when it comes to spiritual abuse, they don't feel comfortable seeking therapy through a religious institution, and that's okay. What's great right now, particularly in the GTA, is that we do have options. So I would recommend considering a private clinic that, as an alternative, if you're not comfortable, that has an understanding of the spiritual aspect of it, because that's also important, along with the psychological aspect. So the clinic I'm at, Cedar Way, would be one option. There's also Canadian Muslim counseling. There's Salam Psychology. There's a lot of resources locally as well. So I would say to start with that. In terms of some basic tips on healing that I would say in more general terms, I think number one is really starting by sitting with the fact that this has happened. I know we talk a lot about being gaslighting and being gaslit. I think we do that to ourselves a lot. Like, did this really happen? Maybe I'm misunderstanding it and I'm misreading it. Is it in my head? That kind of needs to stop. This is not step one in terms of the healing. If you've already come to a place where you realize, yeah, the warning signs are all there. I don't feel good. This doesn't feel right. I bounced it off trusted people. You need to be able to sit with that knowledge and awareness of something bad happened to you. That's step one, is the awareness. Step two is often there's a lot of emotions. A lot of the ones that I mentioned at the beginning, in terms of anger, fear, disgust, shame, a lot of those are going to be present. You need to sit with them. It's going to be hard. And again, it's always great to have a guide for that. But healing begins by actually feeling those natural emotions, because often what humans do, we do not like to feel discomfort. We shut things down. So part of healing is going to be sitting with those emotions. Something else that I already mentioned is kind of creating that distance from the abuser and perhaps that environment. That's going to be important for you to kind of clear your head, because in many ways it can become like a drug, to be honest with you. It's something you've gotten very used to, is this abuser, and you need to kind of wean yourself off of that. And it comes in stages. And I know a lot of people will hear and talk about how there's some back and forth that happens with, in these type of abusive situations, where people sometimes kind of distance themselves and then they go back. Then they distance themselves and they go back. It can take time for people to kind of really disentangle themselves from abusive people. I think one of the really important ones that people don't talk about enough, and maybe it makes people uncomfortable, is grieving the relationship. And I know that might be icky, for lack of a better word, for some people. But for those that have been in it, the relationship that you had with or have with that abuser is an important one in your life. It's one that has likely been one of the main sources of a relationship you have currently, due to the isolation that's occurred. And in many ways, often people will talk about the fact that it wasn't all bad, right? So it might not be something you'll be able to talk about with everyone, but it is important that you grieve that relationship. That's part of the healing process. There's also grieving that needs to occur sometimes in terms of if there's community impact, whether it be community gossip against you, if things come out, what have you, is how do you grieve being kind of othered, or being in a different footing with the community? And grieving the change, and what happens for a lot of people is the spiritual aspect of things, right? I don't think it comes as a surprise for people, and what makes me so sad is that how can your spiritual relationship with God not be impacted as a result of this? And I want to say that that's normal. It's to be expected. But that does not mean that is what it's going to remain. But grieving is going to be part of that process. Education is going to be important. So again, like a session like today, There's a lot of great resources online. There's webinars. There's great information out nowadays. That's important. Again, going back to what I said initially, knowledge is power. It is going to be really important you have an understanding so you know that this is real. This isn't just happening to you. This isn't in your head. This is unfortunately more widespread than I think a lot of people realize. And inshallah, with that knowledge of what spiritual abuse looks like, how it plays out, what are the warning signs, it can also be preventative for you. Because I know as much as we'd all like to believe if it's happened once, it won't happen again. That's just not true. So by having that knowledge, you can inshallah help yourself as well as help those around you. This one might be a little hard for some people, depending on where you're at in the journey, is adding in spiritually healthy practices. Our religion is beautiful. It has a lot of amazing practices that are healing, but I'm going to be very clear, depending where you're at and the level of spiritual abuse, you might not be there right now to have spiritual healing strategies and skills, and that's okay. I would just say is depending where you're at, just keep the door open for that being revisited for you, because again, spiritual practices can be transformative. I don't have much more to it. But in terms of what we can do as a community in terms of spiritual abuse, I really wanted to make sure, something that really stands out to me is that we really need to make sure we're centering the conversations around survivors, not the perpetrators. And that's something that I'm sure I'm not the only one that's noticed that over the last several years, is that's not usually what happens. And for whatever reason, whether it be it's a celebrity sheikh or whatever it might be, is that we're centering them. I think as a community, we can and should do better. And we need to be centering conversations around with survivors in terms of how we can do better for them as a community. So what I mean by that is, how can we support them financially? How, if needed, how can we support them legally? How can we support them socially? How we can support them in terms of therapy and counseling? That's how we build healthy communities. And it's going to be really important that, yes, there's a place for abusers, that we want them to be held accountable. We want to do better in terms of policies and procedures. But my hope is we get to a place where that's already been, we've done that work, right? That we're ready to go. Unfortunately, even when you put in policies and procedures, these things happen. That's the reality of it. But we should do that work so we are able to better support survivors. Very briefly, in terms of what we can do better as a community, what I would say is we can do better in when people come to us, and these things, conversations happen. People are kind of testing the waters with you to see if you're open, is to really try to in some ways just listen without judgment and with kindness. And I know it seems obvious, but we often hear, I don't know about you guys, I know I have a knee-jerk reaction when these things happen, is being defensive about our spiritual leaders, about our religion, is these things don't happen. Are you sure? Are you misinterpreting what happened? There's this natural thing for us to want to protect, particularly our spiritual leaders, because we do hold them to a higher standard and higher respect. But again, when you have a higher standard or power, with that power comes a lot more responsibility, right? So we need to be very careful in that we do our part. So we try to listen without judgment, listen with kindness. And if you don't know what you're doing, go to someone who knows more. And if they don't know what they're doing, please ask someone else. Because if we want healthy communities, which I think we all do, is we need to be there for one another. And if we don't know what we're doing, somebody else will know what they're doing. So your part is to listen to them and to try to ask. And finally, I know it's a very heavy topic, but as Muslims, we want to always be focused in on being hopeful and light. For me, what brings me hope and light is, if there are any survivors here, if you know anyone, is that there is help out there. There is, alhamdulillah, there is a lot of supports out there. So I want that to be clear. And also, I don't know about you guys, these conversations were not happening a few years ago openly. I can't think of what masjids were having these conversations openly a few years ago. I know we're not where we should be yet, but there should be hope in that there is increased accountability happening of abusers. We are questioning things more. We're asking for more. So please be hopeful. And with that, I'm going to pass it back.